If you were born between 1977 and 1983, you're not a millennial. You're not Gen X. You're a Xennial. And psychologists say you might be the most psychologically unique generation to ever exist. Here's why you're different from everyone else. Let quote. Talk about something that's been overlooked for too long. There's a micro-generation that exists in the shadows between Gen X and millennials, and if you're part of it, you've probably felt like you don't quite fit anywhere. You remember life before the internet, but you also helped build the digital world. You had an analog childhood and a digital adulthood, and psychologists are now discovering that this unique position has created something extraordinary, a generation with cognitive advantages that no one else possesses. Welcome to the world of Xennials. Born roughly between 1977 and 1983, you're the bridge generation. And according to research from social psychologists and generational experts, you've developed a rare set of psychological traits that make you fundamentally different from the generations on either side of you. Here quote. What makes you psychologically unique? You're the last generation to have an analog childhood. You played outside until the streetlights came on. You made plans without cell phones and actually kept them. You looked up information in encyclopedias. You wrote letters by hand. You developed patience, imagination, and self-reliance because you had to. But here's the crucial part. You were young enough when the digital revolution hit to adapt completely. You're not digital natives like millennials, but you're not digital immigrants like Gen X. You're bilingual, fluent in both analog and digital worlds. Psychologists call this the Xennial advantage. Research from the Australian sociologist Dan Woodman, who coined the term Xennial, reveals that this generation experienced a unique developmental period. Your formative years happened during a technological sweet spot. You developed real-world social skills before social media existed, but you mastered technology before it became too complex or addictive. You got the best of both worlds. Let quote. Let's talk about what this did to your brain. Neurologically, you experienced something no other generation ever will. Your childhood brain developed without screens, building robust neural pathways for face-to-face communication, spatial awareness, and delayed gratification. Then, during your critical adolescent and early adult years, when the brain is still highly plastic, you learned to navigate the digital world. You didn't just adapt to technology, you helped shape it. You remember the internet when it was still innocent, when social media didn't exist, when online interactions were novelties, not necessities. This created a psychological phenomenon that researchers are calling adaptive duality. You can work equally well with handwritten notes or digital documents. You can have deep in-person conversations or meaningful text exchanges. You value privacy, but understand connectivity. You remember boredom as a normal part of life, which gave you creativity, but you also embrace efficiency through technology. You're comfortable with ambiguity, because you've lived through massive societal changes and adapted to all of them. Studies on generational psychology show that Xennials have lower rates of anxiety compared to millennials and Gen Z. Why? Because you developed coping mechanisms before the internet could provide instant solutions to every problem. You learned to sit with discomfort. You figured things out without Google. You navigated uncertainty without constant reassurance from online communities. This built psychological resilience that younger generations raised with instant digital comfort often lack. But here's where it gets really interesting. Unlike Gen X, who can be cynical about technology, or millennials, who sometimes can't imagine life without it, you have perspective on both sides. You remember the freedom of disconnection, so you're not enslaved by your devices. But you also understand the power of connection, so you're not resistant to progress. This balanced perspective gives you a mental flexibility that's incredibly rare. Research from the Pew Research Center shows that Xennials have unique economic psychology too. You entered the workforce during the dot-com boom, saw it crash, rebuilt, then survived the 2008 recession. You've experienced enough economic volatility to be cautious but not enough to be defeated. You're realistic about money, but not cynical. You're ambitious but not entitled. You work hard because you know nothing is guaranteed, but you also know how to find opportunities because you've seen technology create them. Let's talk about your relationship with nostalgia. Unlike Gen X, whose nostalgia is often tinged with cynicism, or millennials, whose nostalgia is performative and Instagram-ready, your nostalgia is genuine and grounding. You remember mixtapes, but you use Spotify. You remember film cameras, but you appreciate digital photography. You're not trying to go back to the past, but you carry its lessons with you. This gives you a rare emotional stability. You're anchored by real memories of a simpler time, but you're not stuck there. Psychologically, You're also the last generation to experience true independence before helicopter parenting became normalized. You rode bikes across town without GPS tracking. You solved problems without immediately calling parents. You made mistakes without them being documented online forever. This built a sense of autonomy and self-efficacy that's increasingly rare. Research shows that Xennials have higher rates of independent decision-making and lower rates of analysis paralysis compared to younger cohorts. Here's something profound. You're the last generation to remember what it felt like to be unreachable. You remember coming home to check the answering machine. You remember making plans and trusting people would show up because there was no way to cancel last minute via text. You developed reliability, commitment, and trust in ways that are almost impossible in today's hyper-connected world. This has given you relationship skills that younger generations struggle to develop. Social psychologists note that Xennials have a unique approach to identity formation. Millennials often construct their identities online through carefully curated personal brands. Gen X tends to be more private and cynical about self-presentation. But Xennials? You formed your core identity offline, in the real world through actual experiences. Then you learned to navigate online spaces without letting them define you. You use social media. It doesn't use you. Your sense of self is solid because it was built on real-world foundations before the digital world could interfere. Let quotes address work psychology. You entered the job market when having a personal website or email address was innovative. You've worked in offices without computers and in offices that are entirely digital. You've sent faxes and Slack messages. You remember when leaving work meant actually leaving work, but you also adapted to remote work seamlessly. This range of experience makes you incredibly valuable in the workplace. You can code switch between traditional and modern work cultures effortlessly. Research on generational trauma and resilience shows something fascinating. Xennials experienced enough of the old world to develop its strengths, patience, resourcefulness, face-to-face communication skills, but adapted to the new world, young enough to avoid becoming obsolete. You're not struggling to keep up with technology like older generations, but you're also not dependent on it like younger ones. You're the perfect hybrid. Here quotes the truth about being a Xennial. You're caught between two worlds, but instead of belonging to neither, you belong to both. You're a translator between generations. You can explain TikTok to your Gen X colleagues and vinyl records to your Gen Z employees. You remember the before times, but you're fully functional in the after times. This makes you psychologically flexible in ways that are becoming increasingly valuable. The challenge of being a Xennial is that you're often invisible in cultural conversations. Media focuses on Gen X cynicism, or millennial struggles, or Gen Z activism. You're the forgotten middle child of generations. But here's what they're missing. You're the bridge. You're the living connection between analog and digital, between old and new, between disconnection and hyperconnection. And that bridge position isn't a weakness, it's a superpower. So if you're a Xennial, stop trying to fit into Gen X or millennial categories. You're neither and both. You're the generation that remembers the world before and helped build the world after. You're psychologically unique because you carry the wisdom of analog living, with the capabilities of digital fluency. You're not lost between generations. You're the lucky few who got to experience both worlds at exactly the right times, and that makes you irreplaceable. Comment your birth year if you're a Xennial, and tell us one analog memory that Gen Z will never understand. Let's see who else is part of this rare microgeneration.